how the Suez crisis continued to unfold. In the last recording, we discussed the background of the issue, such as the rise of Nasser to power, and why the Suez Canal became an issue in and of itself when Nasser decided to nationalize the canal and take away the revenues from the British and French-controlled Suez Canal Company. This is what prompted the crisis to occur. At that point, the French had had enough of Nasser and were ready to get rid of him, and they found a willing partner in Israel. However, the British weren't quite sure yet if this was the right action to take, and that's basically where we left off with in the last recording. But we do know that the British government did not like what Nasser had been doing, not just with the Suez Canal seizure, but also some of Nasser's other actions that had begun to damage the relationship between Britain and Egypt. So if you look at the top of 125, this is basically where we're beginning today. Nasser, not only with seizing the canal, but also his actions in seeing himself as a leader of Arab nationalism, had begun to strain the relationship. When the canal itself was seized by Egyptian forces, Britain was damaged politically and economically. Britain still had influence in the Middle East, and that was something that they were trying to hold on to with the Baghdad Pact that we had mentioned in the last recording. And so by Nasser seizing the canal, this damaged Britain's political influence in the Middle East, and it would also have some pretty substantial financial implications because most of the oil that was supplied to Britain, the ships had to pass through the Suez Canal to get back to Britain. Therefore, this would hurt them financially because now they would be not receiving the revenues. They would have to pay the Egyptian government now instead to pass through these waters. And along with that, Nasser was assumed by the British to be becoming closer to the Soviet Union, and that was seen by his actions with refusing to join the Baghdad Pact, which had been signed previously by other countries such as Great Britain, obviously, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan. Nasser had refused to sign it when it first was created back in 1955. And we also discussed the fact that Nasser had made a pretty significant arms deal with the Czechs, which really was a front for the Soviet Union. And so that's why Britain assumed that Nasser was becoming closer tied to the Soviet world. So by October of 1956, just shortly after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the British finally realized that they were ready to enter into a three-way agreement with France and Israel, who were already ready to take out Nasser from power in Egypt. They met together in Paris in October of 1956 and ended up creating the Sèvres Protocol. If you look at page 125, you can see the details of this secret meeting, which took place from October 22nd to 24th, between the representatives of Great Britain, Israel, and France. And you can see how this plan that they created was going to unfold. These plans that were drawn up at Sèvres were basically based on staged events for the accomplishment of main objectives, which was ultimately to remove Nasser from power. So really it wasn't to try to take the canal back and put it back under the governing of the French-British company that controlled it. It was ultimately to take Nasser out and remove him as a threat to British interests and also to Israeli interests. I would encourage you to pause the recording and look at page 125 at the 7 different parts of this agreement. The fact that this was to remain strictly secret shows you that this was definitely a staged thing that they were trying to put forth, and it was based on the actions of the Israeli forces, and in return the British and French governments issuing of ultimatums, and it was all to try to end up ousting Nasser from power. So make sure that you look through those different portions of this protocol to see what the plan was. Let's look at the planning behind the Sèvres Protocol, or the rationale for it. It was based on initially an Israeli attack into the Sinai Peninsula to destroy Fedayeen camps. Since the time that the 1948 war occurred, the Israelis definitely wanted Gaza back, which was the strip that the Egyptians had gained, because this particular strip was kind of a hotbed of Fedayeen activity that had escalated since the 1948 war. And this was also in the area that that the Israeli ships were being blockaded and inspected by Egyptian forces. So for the Israelis, they wanted this land back so that this would not be an issue for them anymore. So that's why this initial attack was to destroy these camps, and then to open up the Red Sea and remove the blockade that had been put up by the Egyptians on Israeli ships to allow free shipping. From there, the British would then issue an ultimatum to both Israel and Egypt to withdraw to 16 kilometers from either side of the Suez Canal. And they just assumed that Nasser would flat out refuse this order, this ultimatum, and that would then give an excuse for Britain and France to intervene militarily and ultimately remove Nasser. The biggest mistake that the British and French and Israelis made in the planning of this event was that they did not consult the United States. Maybe they assumed that the U.S. would go along with this because we knew that Nasser was getting close to the Soviets as well, and they knew that we had supported Israel quite substantially in their establishment of their own state. But they did not put us in on the discussions of these meetings, and that was going to be a huge blow to them as the plan played out, as you'll see. So this plan, generated by the British, the French, and the Israelis, unfolded beginning October 29th of 1956, and that was the beginning of a four-pronged Israeli attack against Egypt with the use of paratroop forces. From there, the next day, the U.S., who saw this action take place, we had intelligence and ways to see what was happening, and that the Israelis were launching this assault, we proposed a resolution to the UN Security Council calling for an end of military actions by Israel, which was of course vetoed by Britain and France because they were the ones who were staging this whole thing. So it might seem surprising that the U.S. would respond this way to try to force Israel to stop. But let's consider the rationale of Eisenhower for a second. Eisenhower was in the midst of campaigning for his next election in 1956, and he and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who we've mentioned previous to this as being the man who initially said he was going to roll back communism and take a very hardline approach. But the two of these guys were really upset at the secretive nature of the British, the French, and the Israelis, and the fact that we weren't consulted in any of this. The U.S. was concerned that support of Israeli and British and French actions in this would have risked ill will in the UN towards us. You know, at this point, the UN was still a pretty new organization, and we did not want to have a bad reputation put on us by participating or giving a green light to these countries that were staging this attack. If we had encouraged aggression, it would have made us look like what the USSR was doing in Eastern Europe. At this same time of the Suez crisis, the Hungarian uprising was occurring, in which protesters in Hungary were being brutally mowed down with tanks and being shot by Soviet troops. So if we were encouraging this type of aggression down in the Middle East, we would basically be doing the same thing that the Soviets were doing. If we got involved in this military action, Eisenhower feared that it could fail or it could bog us down and be a drawn-out thing. And he definitely didn't want that for our country. We also feared that Soviet volunteer fighters and the risk of a major war, as the Soviets would see an opportunity to take advantage of this situation. I think probably the biggest concern for us is that the Soviets might use this crisis as an excuse to get more involved and intervene more in Middle East affairs. You can see evidence of this if you look at that source F at the top of 127, which is from the U.S. Department State Press Release 604 on November 29th of 1956. So now we understand why Eisenhower was so against this action taking place. It was a variety of reasons, but in the end, he did not want the Soviets to gain off of this. On October 31st, the next day, the British and French bombers, as a continuation of their protocol that they created, began their air attacks on Egyptian targets. After that, the next day on November 1st, the U.S. went directly to the UN General Assembly, saying that their Security Council proposal was vetoed by the British and French and wasn't able to pass there. We took our case directly to the UN General Assembly, which met in an emergency session on November 2nd. The resolution finally passed here with a 64-5 vote calling for an immediate ceasefire. The British and the French ignored this resolution and continued their military action. And at that point, the Soviets also began to say that they were considering taking military action against Israel, who had started this whole attack. Therefore, Eisenhower and Dulles, being that the tension was increasing and events were risking to spiral downwards, put a lot of pressure on the new British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden. And basically, we threatened them with financial things such as removing any type of, or blocking any loans from the International Monetary Fund and withdrawing our funds from London banks if they continued to engage in this military action. And under that kind of pressure, the British informed the French that they just simply could not continue this operation. So on November 6th, finally the British and the French agreed to a ceasefire. However, it's interesting to note that the Israeli forces remained in Sinai. They did not take them out, even though the British and the French were giving up. And that shows you again the tenacity of the Israelis, how they were going to continue working for what they felt was the security of their newly formed state. Because remember, in the beginning, their main goal was not necessarily to oust Nasser from power, but it was to secure the Gaza Strip, which had become the hotbed of Palestinian Arab terrorists that were working against the Israeli states. So this staged plan failed miserably for the British and the French, and to some extent the Israelis. However, with the Israelis able to keep their forces in the Sinai, they continued to show their determination to fight for their continued existence, and that they weren't going to give up lands or ignore threats by terrorist groups. You could say that they benefited in that respect by continuing to earn recognition and for their efforts. The U.S. showed that in the end, even though Britain and France were our strong allies, that we weren't going to tolerate us being put at risk for continuing Cold War tensions with the Soviets and letting the Soviets gain off of this in any way. So even if it meant cutting loose our Western allies, we were going to make sure that we did not become harmed, and that the Soviets could benefit from all of this. So in the final recording about the Suez Crisis, we'll be looking at the effects of this and how it impacted Britain, France, Israel, the Soviet Union, and the United States, and basically the continuation of the Cold War from that point on.